Hello and welcome to the first of the Unit 3 PowerPoints. This one's going to go through all about 3.1, which is about the economic, social and political impact of the Great Depression, and then a lot of focus on the appeal of Nazism and communism as well. Let's make a start on it. Remember that it's a good idea before we begin to just quickly brainstorm what you can remember about those topics so you can pay close attention to the areas that you feel you are least confident on. To begin with, we're going to be thinking about an event of major significance for many different countries, the Great Depression. We're going to obviously focus on the impact on Germany. We're going to look at the economic, social and political consequences of this, but it's important to start with economic because the economic impact of it had an impact on society and therefore social consequences, and it also had an impact on the political situation in Germany as well. Now, first of all, we need to think about the cause of the depression in Germany. And obviously, this is partially down to things like the Wall Street crash. But it's also important to remember that there were some long-term fundamental weaknesses with the German economy, as you'll have already seen from Unit 2.1. If you can't remember the problems with the German economy, go back to that video and re-watch it. Essentially, Germany was very much dependent on American loans and on investment from America, especially since April 1924 when they had signed the Dawes Plan and they had agreed to have that 800 million mark loan from America. Now, not only that, but the American industry was really important for them because the USA had been the largest overseas market for German manufactured goods. And therefore, if there were economic problems in the USA, this was going to have an enormous impact on Germany, as well as many other industrialised nations. Now, on the 29th of October, the value of shares fell by $10 billion. We know about the events in the Wall Street crash, but we don't need to focus on them for this particular exam. Instead, we need to know about the impact on Germany. And as a result of their own problems, these American banks recalled their loans. Now, at this time, Germany needs more investment to try and stimulate their economy, but instead money is being withdrawn at this point. So we now need to think about what was the impact on Germany itself. Well, first of all, many companies went bankrupt, and between 1930 and 1932, 50,000 businesses in Germany collapsed. Now, that obviously has a major impact on the amount of people that are unemployed. We can see at the bottom here that by 1932, 1/3 of all the German workers were registered as unemployed. That's 17 million people that are asking for benefits from their government. But historians think this doesn't even reflect the true scale of unemployment. They think that it's not actually the 6 million that were registered. They think that it was actually more like 8 million. Now, remember that unemployment had been a lingering issue from even the Golden Age. Remember that it never got below 1.3 million, and it actually hit a high in 1926 of 3 million. Even before the Great Depression, they were still dealing with 1.9 million people that were unemployed, and obviously this worsens as a result of the Great Depression. Now, one of the reasons why so many companies go bankrupt is because Germany's export trade declined. You can see here that it declined by 61%. And because people aren't buying their goods, they therefore stop producing as much, and their industrial production falls by 58%. This explains why there were so many people unemployed, because they don't need as many workers if they're not producing as many goods. And even Britain was badly affected by the Great Depression. But we can see that they're not as badly affected when it comes to things like them decreasing their industrial production by 11% in comparison to Germany's 58%. Now, it's not only production that is hit by this, but also confidence in their financial system. By May 1931, an Austrian bank has collapsed, and there ends up being 5 major banks that collapse by the end of that year. Essentially, Germany's banking system had been plunged into crisis, and this is because there is a loss of confidence. Remember, there was a real psychological element for the Germans as well, because they'd already been through the trauma of hyperinflation in 1923. So most German people were very negatively affected by the Great Depression. There are some groups that hit worse than others. For For instance, in people in industrial areas are particularly badly hit, and also farmers. Remember that farmers hadn't even benefited from the improved conditions during the so-called golden years of 1924 to 1929. And actually, by 1932, 18,000 farmers were now bankrupt, and they were really struggling, even more so than they had been during the golden years when they'd had experiences like the Farmers' Revenge by 1928. So the economic impact of the Great Depression was very significant. Pause the video here if you want to make some revision notes of some key statistics. As well as knowing the key statistics for the economic impact, we also have to know about the social impact. And it's important to remember that statistics like 6 million people being officially unemployed fail to convey the extent of human suffering that took place as a result of the Great Depression. It doesn't tell us about the psychological impact of being unemployed and the anxiety that came from that. Now, the German government had made a lot of promises for social welfare right from the very beginning when their constitution was published in August 1919. But the reality was that due to the strain placed by the Great Depression, the costs overwhelmed the budget. And from 1930, the government had to try and move to limit the amount of welfare paid. For instance, they only entitled benefits for a fixed period, and after that you would have to apply to the local authority for some relief, and that wouldn't have been as substantial. But not only that, they were also doing things as well, for instance, paying women less benefit than men, and young people less than what adults would receive. So it wasn't always a fair system, and there were a lot of complaints about this system at this point. Now, what the statistics also don't show is the fact that there were regional differences as well, and some people were particularly hard hit. Some areas were harder hit than others. For instance, if we're thinking about the area of Brand-Urbersdorf, in that particular area, half the population were receiving benefits, and that's because most of them worked at the same glassworks factory, and when that shut down, it then had such a knock-on impact on that community. As a result of the Great Depression, shantytowns were created all over Germany, and many people didn't have access to very much food. One American journalist who was travelling around Germany during the Great Depression talked about the diet and the amount of food that they had was too little to live on, but too much to die from. And I think that shows the misery of the Great Depression for many. Diseases that were linked to poverty, like TB and rickets, ended up increasing over this period. And we're going to think as well about the impact on young people and women. Now, thinking about the young, they certainly hadn't benefited from the golden years as much as other people. If we're thinking about, what kind of problems they were dealing with before, even when things were going really well in the apparent golden age, they were already dealing with high numbers of unemployed and high numbers of unemployment. Because when people left school at 14 to go and get an apprenticeship, they were finding with the post-war economy that there weren't as many job opportunities. This problem gets even worse as a result of the Great Depression, and you can see that 39% of boys between the age of 14 and 25 were unemployed. In terms of girls, the figure was slightly lower, but it was 25.2%. Now, the consequence of this is that many young people decided to join gangs, and some of them even decided to join extremist political organisations, for instance, groups like the Hitler Youth and also the group for the KPD. So lots of young people ended up feeling very frustrated about being left behind. The government did try and help them with things like day centres, and they also introduced labour schemes to try and give them some skills. But they were paid less than minimum wage for this, and this led to some strikes for higher wages in October 1930 and June 1932. So young people felt very frustrated that at a time of economic crisis, they were being forgotten, and they felt that the measures didn't go far enough. It is clear that the government did try and put in some quick fixes to help them, but arguably they didn't go far enough with those. Let's try and think about what happened for women then. Now, for women, there was supposed to be this idea of the new woman in the 1920s, a woman that was equal and free. If we're thinking about employment, the amount of women actually in employment hadn't really increased since before the First World War, but still at least there had been some changes for some women. Some people argue that as a result of the Great Depression, those changes were reversed, that progress was stopped and went backwards. For instance, we can see that there were lots of attacks on women for being double earners. That was a woman that was married, whose husband also had a job. A lot of people felt that those women should give up their jobs and each family should only have one income coming in. As a result of the general support for this policy, in May 1932, married civil servants, female civil servants, could be dismissed, and 1,000 of them were dismissed from the Reich Postal Service. So this shows for women, the impact of the Great Depression was enormous, and in lots of ways, the changes and the progress that was made was reversed because of the desperation of the situation with the Great Depression. So you need to know about the social impact of that. You can pause the video here if you want to make some revision notes on it. The final area you've got to know about is the political impact of the Depression. Now, this is something that is going to be covered over a lot of different slides because it is a very broad area that you've got to know about. It includes these 3 different phases that we've got on this slide here. First of all, we're obviously going to need to know about its impact on the Grand Coalition. So there had been this Grand Coalition formed between 1928 and March 1930, led by Müller, and obviously this has to deal with the impact of the Great Depression, and they have to make a lot of the difficult decisions about the welfare benefits. Now, they end up collapsing this government by March 1930 because they can't agree, and it was such a broad coalition with 5 different political parties, and in some ways that was a strength, but obviously it was its ultimate weakness as well, that they couldn't agree on how to handle the Great Depression. So the second phase that we need to know about is the presidential government, where essentially there is no party with a majority, there are no effective coalitions formed with majorities, and therefore all the laws passed from March 1930 have to be passed by Hindenburg using Article 48. So that's our second phase, the presidential government, and then obviously we've got Hitler being appointed Chancellor in January 1933, and he immediately starts to create a dictatorship, which he achieves by August 1934. So they're the 3 different areas that we'll need to know about within the Great Depression, and just gives you a bit of a quick overview of what happens politically in Germany and the different phases that they go through. As we've already mentioned, the Great Depression had numerous political consequences. Things like the collapse of the Grand Coalition, making it an opportunity for the extremist parties to gain support, and also leading to an intensification of political violence. Now, that first area, the collapse of the Grand Coalition, remember this is something we looked at in the 2.3 video on political stability in the so-called golden years. We know that Grand Coalition had been formed in June 1928 of 5 different parties. It was led by the SPD, and Müller was the Chancellor at this point. Now, the strength of the coalition is the fact there were 5 different parties within it. It had represented a broad support from the public. It actually had more than 60% of the Republic voting in favour of it. There were lots of different strengths of the Grand Coalition. However, in one way, the 5 parties was a strength, and in another way it was a weakness, because it meant that they had a lot of fundamental differences. Even thinking about when it was more successful before the Great Depression, it was formed in June 1928, but it wasn't until the spring of 1929 that they agreed on their policies, because they had such different ideas when it came to budget and foreign policy, 2 of the biggest areas of government. Now, in terms of what actually broke this, what led to its collapse in March 1930 was the state finances. This was the origin of the division. Essentially, unemployment pay had put them in a very difficult position, and the national insurance scheme was facing a large deficit. Basically, they were heavily in debt. They couldn't agree on how to tackle it. The right side of the coalition, parties like the DVP, wanted to try and reduce unemployment benefits, whereas the left decided that they wanted to try and protect this by increasing taxes in order to maintain the level of benefits for those that needed them. Now, this essentially caused a deadlock between them, and in the end, Muller of the SPD resigned in March 1930 as they no longer maintained this majority because they couldn't push through laws because they were all disagreeing. Now, this is really significant because after the fall of the Grand Coalition in March 1930, democracy is effectively dead in Germany. It technically exists until the end of the Weimar Republic from January 1933, but actually it's essentially dead already because at this point they then start relying on Article 48 and using Hindenburg to pass laws. The Reichstag essentially becomes quite unmanageable, as we're going to see under Brüning. So Müller has quit, Brüning becomes the new chancellor, and this is because of the influence of elites, people like Hindenburg and Schleicher, who have basically convinced that Brüning will be able to kind of start a more authoritarian rule. They also excluded the SPD, remember, who had been the leaders of the Grand Coalition, and the SPD are no longer part of the government. Generally, we can see obviously that dealing with the Great Depression has led to the fall of this, but I would like you to think about your own views on this, about to what extent can we say the collapse is due to the Great Depression? Would you say that the Great Depression is the sole reason for the collapse of it, or are there other reasons? The next area that you need to know about is the political impact of the Great Depression regarding the elections in September 1930. Now, the previous elections that had been held were in 1928, and remember that's where the Grand Coalition had been formed. September 1930 is absolutely crucial because this is where we get the growth of extremist parties and their support. If we think, for instance, about the Nazis, when 1928 they only had 2.6% of the vote, or 12 seats. And by this election in September 1930, it goes to 107 seats, which is the equivalent of 18.3% of the vote. So Müller has quit. Brüning has become the new chancellor after Hindenburg decides to put him in that position, and he was picked, as we mentioned already, because he was authoritarian. He was essentially a respectable conservative politician who wanted firm leadership in times of a crisis especially, and the reality was that they were using him as to establish this new authoritarian rule. His response to the growing economic crisis caused a constitutional crisis because he cut expenditure and raised taxes in order to balance the budget. Now, this was incredibly controversial at the time. Obviously, there were lots of people that agreed with him, that felt it was necessary, but it upset a lot of the population. And some people say that it's Brüning being the so-called hunger chancellor that pushed lots of more moderate people into voting for extremists like the Nazis and the communists. Even the Reichstag itself hated this idea of cutting expenditure and raising taxes at a time of economic crisis, and they even rejected this bill in July 1930. But Brüning just responded by putting these proposals into effect using Article 48. Remember that we've said that after the collapse of the Grand Coalition, they heavily use Article 48, and essentially laws aren't passed anymore using the Reichstag. The Reichstag weren't very happy about this. They disagreed with it and they protested over the legality of this. Remember that Article 48 is only supposed to be used as a kind of worst case scenario. And the response was that Hindenburg dissolved the Reichstag and called new elections. Now, those elections, as we've already mentioned, changed the political landscape. They were hoping to try and get more support for a centre-right coalition and be able to push these things through legally, but in reality they had completely misjudged the situation. As we mentioned, the Nazis gained a lot of votes, about 6.5 million, going from 12 to 107 seats, or 2.6% of the vote, to 18.3%. But they're not the only extremist party that gains from this. The communists do as well. They gain nearly 1 million votes and they go up to 77 seats. And you can see they've got about 13% of the vote in comparison to the 10.8% that they had in 1928. Now, when we think about the extremists together, this is a really shocking statistic that we have got that 40% in the September 1930 elections were voting for undemocratic parties. What's the impact of this then? Well, obviously, it makes the Reichstag even more unmanageable. It makes it very difficult for democratic parliamentary government to function, and therefore the Reichstag doesn't even meet at all between February and October 1931, as it's essentially pointless at this time, especially because now you have a lot of Nazis that are able to go to the Reichstag, they can disrupt proceedings, and they were quite well known for doing that. If you want to know more about Bruning's impact as Chancellor, you can look at that in the 3.3 video. The third area you need to know about for the political impact of the Great Depression, the third consequence, is about the intensification of political violence. Now, this is something we've thought about throughout Unit 1, 2, and now into Unit 3. In Unit 1, we thought about the crisis years of 1918 to 1923. We know that there were frequent riots and outbreaks of violence. For instance, the 376 politicians being assassinated by groups like Organisation Council. Don't forget there's also as well things like the Spartacist uprising and also the numerous putches as well. Between 1924 and 1929, violence did subside, but it didn't completely disappear. Now, we know that there were at least 50 deaths as a result of political violence. However, the Nazis claimed that they lost 29 in this period, and the communists said that they lost 92. No matter what, we know that the violence did increase dramatically between 1930 and 1933. Probably as a result of the growth of extremist parties in this period, the fact they feel more confident about potentially seizing power or certainly wanting to make themselves even more well known and thought of at this time when people are desperate. Now, they are normally fighting through their paramilitary groups. The communists have their own group called the Red Front Fighters League, and the Nazis have the stormtroopers, the SA, the brown shirts. You can use whatever name for them you find easiest. So what did their groups do? What did the Red Front Fighters League, what did the stormtroopers do? Well, they both attempted to break up their opponents' political meetings, and rival marches often turned into full-scale riots. Sometimes, for instance, the SA would go and attend the communist meetings, pretending to be communists and then starting brawls within it. Sometimes they would try and storm into the areas where they were having meetings. But no matter what they were doing, whether it was violence that broke out on the streets or by going into each other's meetings, in 1931 alone, 42 Nazis were killed and 52 communists as well as a result of political violence. So we can see that things are becoming more extreme. Now, Bruning wants to try and control it, and so in December 1931, he issues a decree banning the wearing of political uniforms. However, the SA continued to wear a uniform, they just changed to white shirts. So Bruning's actions here weren't very effective. In April 1932, Hindenburg then issued a decree outlawing the SA, but this also failed as SA membership continued to grow. For instance, they had 400,000 members by the end of 1932. So essentially, the government tried to control this political violence, but they weren't very effective, and the violence was not brought under control. We're also going to think about the political impact and the failure of Bruning's government. Now, if you're in Year 12 and you're watching this after we finish studying 3.1, this isn't technically belonging to 3.1, but it fits really well here in knowing a little bit more detail about Bruning's government. So I'm going to go over it quickly and we'll then recap it when we get to 3.3. So we've mentioned about how Bruning was the Chancellor between March 1930, after the collapse of the Grand Coalition, until May 1932. So he was Chancellor for a couple of years. So what we're going to do is just think through a timeline of what was going on during his time as Chancellor. And I want you to think, as we're talking through this, about whether Bruning was the last defender of democracy or its enemy. Bruning has been somebody that has really divided historians and been quite controversial, with some people seeing him as the last defender and some people seeing him as the enemy, his government being a dismal failure and responsible for the Nazis coming to power. See what you think at the end of this. So thinking about a timeline of his time as Chancellor then, begins in March 1930 after the collapse of the Grand Coalition over what to do with unemployment benefits. Hindenburg, on somebody called General Schleicher's advice, appoints Brüning as Chancellor, hoping that he will be more authoritarian. Brüning then forms a government that is centre-right, but without a majority in the Reichstag. Remember, at the end of the Grand Coalition, democracy is effectively dead in Germany. In July 1930, the Reichstag, remember, rejected the government's finance bill. They wouldn't agree to Brüning's so-called hunger chancellor methods, and instead of trying to compromise to win parliamentary support, Brüning just had the bill passed using Article 48. The Reichstag were very angry about that, and then Brüning asked Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag, and he was hoping to hold some elections where he would gain more support. That was a crucial decision, a terrible decision at that point, where they clearly couldn't read the political climate. And in September 1930, that is the elections where the extremists, the communists and the Nazis gain drastic support. Remember, the Nazis go from 12 seats to 107, or 2.6, to 18.3% of the vote, and the KPD gained over 1 million votes and got 77 seats. So it is a really crucial decision that he makes there. And already you can think about, was he trying to be the last defender of democracy, trying to make the Reichstag more manageable, or would we blame him for being the enemy of the Weimar Republic and allowing those extremists to gain that support? So think about your ideas for that so far. What else did he do then between September 1930 and 1932? Well, generally, as we know already, the Reichstag became unmanageable after September 1930, and therefore he relied on presidential decrees rather than using the Reichstag. The SPD actually supported him and said, at least it's better than anything but Hitler. Brüning also did try to do what he could to stop the worsening economic situation. For instance, he did try and campaign to get reparations ended, and he did actually get a suspension in payments. However, he took little action to reduce the slump that was causing rising unemployment. In April 1932, Brüning had banned the SA in an attempt to reduce street violence. And in April 1932 as well, we have the presidential elections. So he's doing what he can, potentially. Maybe you think he's not going far enough to try and stop the extremists, but they don't really manage to do it. Remember that the SA carry on in things like the white shirts before this, and the ban on them as well doesn't last for very long. As we're going to see, it ends in May 1932, so it's only lasting about a month. Also, Hitler has managed to get nearly 14 million votes in the 1932 presidential elections, almost, as much as Hindenburg. It's quite shocking the amount that he manages to get. It's about 37% of the vote, so it's quite extreme. And this also led to some people claiming the Nazis should be included in the government because obviously they're showing significant support from the population. So far, it's been quite a chaotic chancellorship. We've had him trying to use the Reichstag, failing, calling elections, making the situation worse. He's been involved in trying to ban political uniforms. It's backfired. He's tried to ban the SA in April 1932. And essentially, in the end, that is one of the things that backfires against him and leads to him losing his position as Chancellor. So finally, let's think about his downfall then. So we've just mentioned the banning of the SA is essentially a thing that ends Bruning's chancellorship. It shows that he's out of touch because essentially the Nazis are almost an unstoppable force at this point, and just trying to outright ban them isn't going to work. So Schleicher, somebody that has been in the background so far, one of Hindenburg's advisors, he basically turns against Brüning because he believes that Brüning's opposition to the Nazis was wrong. He didn't like the Nazis himself, but he felt that actually a better way to move forward was to deal with the Nazis rather than trying to do things like banning the SA, which he was worried would lead to some kind of revolution from the Nazis, especially as the Nazis have received 14 million votes for Hitler in the presidential elections of April 1932. So Schleicher then starts scheming with Hindenburg, and Hindenburg then dismissed Brüning because he didn't like his proposals to break up some bankrupt Prussian estates, which we'll come back to in 3.3. Essentially, he didn't like his dealing with the Nazis, and he didn't like some of his ideas for land reform. Now, this was not about him losing a confidence vote in the Reichstag. This was just about Schleicher and Hindenburg turning against Brüning and deciding that he wasn't the man for the job anymore. Instead, after this, they decide to put Papen in charge of a government between May 1932 and then December, and afterwards Schleicher himself has a turn at being Chancellor as well for just a month between December 1932 and January 1933. So now we've got to the end of Brüning. I want you to think about those ideas that we discussed before. Do you think he was the last offender of democracy? Was he its enemy? What are your thoughts on Brüning? It's definitely worth writing them down so that you've got those kind of ideas for future exam arguments. Just like with the last slide, this information here isn't technically in 3.1, but it's worth knowing about the direction that Germany was going in, because it's still all related to the political impact of the Great Depression. So we've already seen that before the Great Depression hit, the 1928 elections show a very small amount of support for the extremist parties, especially the Nazis. In September 1930, it completely changed the political landscape. Out of desperation, lots of people started voting for extremists. For instance, the Nazis went up to 107 seats, or 18.3% of the vote. Then if we think about the next elections that happened, we just mentioned that while Brüning was the Chancellor, there was the April 1932 presidential elections. Now, this was always scheduled to happen. Remember that presidents were elected every 7 years. Hindenburg had been elected back in 1925, so they were having this election in April 1932 as planned. Now, the next elections that come up afterwards, the extremists gain even more support. However, the Nazis are much more successful than the communists at kind of broadening their support and gaining large amounts of new followings. So these two elections take place during the time of Papen as Chancellor. We'll cover him in more detail in the 3.3 election. But essentially, just like Brüning, he wasn't the most successful of chancellors. He didn't even have a government that was full of politicians. His cabinet is actually nicknamed the Cabinet of Barons because essentially a lot of the people that are deciding on government policy aren't even in the actual normal governments. And he is the person, remember, that is chancellor between May and December 1932. So the first election, the one that's actually really crucial for you to know about, is July 1932. Now, it's no surprise, as the Great Depression was still having an enormous impact on German society, that the moderate parties lost support. Germany's political life became even more polarised in comparison to the September 1930 elections. So it was just showing the kind of worsening of the support for democracy and the fact that there are greater support for the extremist parties. Now, these elections led to Hitler being in a stronger position in his deals with Papen and Schleicher. For instance, they offer Hitler the position of Vice-Chancellor to try and make the Reichstag manageable, but he decides to vote against that, and he says that he is not going to accept the position of Vice-Chancellor. He only wants to be in charge of day-to-day government and therefore having the role of Chancellor. He essentially also brings down Papin's government through a vote of no confidence. So July 1932 elections are really crucial. And remember, this is where the Nazis are going to 230 seats in the Reichstag, or 37% of the vote. So it's basically matching the support from April 1932, where Hitler had almost 14 million votes and 37%, suggesting that he should be the president. And as you can see in those elections as well, the communists have gained some support and have gone to 89 seats, 14%. And generally, obviously, we can see here in 1932, in the July elections, more than 51% are voting for extremists and therefore voting to reject democracy. So things look especially bleak at that point for the democratic governments. However, quite interestingly, in November 1932, the Nazis did lose some support. Some middle-class voters had felt alienated by Hitler's refusal to join the coalition and his attacks on Papin, and therefore you can see the Nazi share of the vote went down to 196 seats, or 33%. However, the communists gained their most ever in November 1932, getting 100 seats, or 16.9% of the vote. Now, there's been lots of statistics in this video. You're not going to be expected to remember them all. You do want to try and have some key ones to be able to rely on in exam questions. For instance, knowing about the 1928 votes for the Nazis have been 2.6%, or 12 seats, and definitely know that it went up in September 1930, but do try and know this July 1932 statistic if you can. And it's also good to know that the communist support grew as well, but at a slower rate. And if you can remember something about the 100 seats, or 17%, 16.9% being the highest share of the vote they ever got, that would be another really good one to know. Obviously, there's lots on here. Great if you're really good at statistics, but if not, just remember those few. So, as I've already mentioned, the 3.1 section of the textbook and the course is quite small, just knowing about the economic, social and 3 political consequences of the Great Depression, the intensification of political violence, the collapse of the Grand Coalition and the rise in support for the extremists. Obviously, this video has covered a little bit about Bruning's time as Chancellor and mentioned about the elections that went on Papin's time as well. But I cover each of these 3 key chancellors, what they did and how they caused the end of democracy in the 3.3 video. So if you're still not quite sure about their exact roles and what was going on during their time as chancellor, don't worry, because this will be covered in the video for 3.3. And if you're in year 12, we won't have studied it by this point. So just a few summary notes of some really key things to understand about the impact of the Great Depression. Generally, we just need to remember that this period that we're studying for Unit 3, 1929-1930 till 1933, saw the gradual decline of democracy as Germany moved from parliamentary government to presidential government and then to dictatorship under Hitler between January 1933 and August 1934. Remember that we talk about this being a presidential government because Hindenburg was using Article 48 frequently to try and sustain governments, and the Reichstag didn't even really meet very regularly, not even meeting between February and October 1931. The prospect of parliamentary government surviving was further weakened by elections. It was already weakened by September 1930, when the Nazis managed to go up to 107 seats, or 18.3% of the vote, and it's further weakened in July 1932, when they got up to 230 votes, or 37% of the vote. In both of these elections, the majority of voters supported extremist parties that were hostile to the parliamentary regime. And there's going to be more on why did people vote for these extremist parties in the next video that is going to be about the appeal of the Nazis and the communists. But essentially, a lot of it comes down to the fact that there was a lack of confidence in the Weimar government and democracy, especially when it came to dealing with economic issues. So if you want to, you could go onto Teams and look at the Unit 3.1 short answer test. You could make sure that you can answer all of those questions. You could make some flashcards if you haven't already and test yourself. That would be a really good idea to make sure that you've understood the key things from this PowerPoint. You could also try making some kind of revision material, for instance, a Cornell grid or a mind map, a revision clock, or you could even try a red pen, black pen activity where you write down everything you can remember from this PowerPoint in one colour, and then you could go back through and look at the information again and add some notes in a second colour. And you could even have a go at an exam question, which is at the bottom here, about the collapse of the Grand Coalition. Well done for watching the video.